Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The sun had barely lifted her face from behind the hills of Amur when Sandra's feet touched the cold floor beside her bed. The floor creaked softly, echoing a quietness that had become part of her soul. She moved like someone rehearsed in routine, calm, precise, not in a hurry but never idle. The birds had begun their morning chatter, stitching the air with chirps and whistles, yet Sandra's heart beat with a silence that had grown louder over the years. She wasn't unhappy, no, that would be too simple a word. She was something else, something between gratitude and weariness, like a candle that still burned but flickered when the wind passed too close. She glanced at the calendar nailed crookedly beside the window. Today marked her 7th wedding anniversary. 7 years, and yet the pages of her marriage felt as though someone else had written them. She smiled to herself, soft and brief, as if the act cost something. Then she stood, adjusted the wrapper around her waist, and made her way to the kitchen. Her mind not in the present, but in the memories she never invited but often entertained. They came like smoke, slowly, without asking, until the room smelled of them. That morning, as she boiled water and sliced yam, her thoughts drifted to the girl she once was. The girl who believed that love, if poured deeply enough into someone, could shape them into something better. But life had a way of turning that kind of girl into the kind of woman who boiled yam in silence while her husband slept without a care. The air was thick with the smell of onion and oil when Dominic finally stirred from sleep, stretching like a man who bore no weight. He walked into the kitchen with one hand scratching his belly, the other wiping his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled. Sandra nodded and slid a plate toward him without speaking. Words between them had become like broken glass, too sharp to walk across casually. Still he ate, and she watched, not with anger, but with the kind of silence that knows things too well to speak. Sandra wasn't born with silver in her spoon, nor was she one to chase gold. She was born into the kind of family that struggled to feed dreams, let alone bodies. Her parents had died in a fire when she was only 10, leaving her in the care of her grandmother, a woman who wore hardship like a second skin. It was in her grandmother's small one-room mud house that Sandra learned how to find strength in places most people feared to look. They lived behind the old Catholic church, and every Sunday morning, Sandra would help sweep the compound before dressing in a faded gown to attend Mass. Her grandmother would watch from the doorway, eyes soft with pride, and whisper, "You're not meant for dust, child. Don't forget that." Sandra never did. She grew up knowing the feel of hunger and the shame of wearing the same uniform until the sleeves gave way, but she never let it harden her. If anything, it softened her toward the world. She gave freely because she knew what it meant to have nothing. By the time she turned 23, Sandra had worked her way through school with borrowed books and part-time tutoring jobs. She became a teacher not just by profession, but by nature, calm, patient, endlessly giving. It was during a community youth program that she met Dominic. He was standing at the back, laughing loudly with a friend, and Sandra noticed him because he laughed with his entire body. Something about him felt alive in a way that drew her in. When their eyes met, she smiled without knowing she had. That was the beginning, the moment her story stepped off the careful path it had walked and took a turn into unfamiliar woods. Dominic wasn't for money either, but he had charm, and sometimes charm is louder than character. He spoke sweetly, listened intently, and promised more than he could ever deliver. But Sandra, with all her lessons and scars, believed him. Maybe not because she was naive, but because she wanted to believe someone could love her without conditions. They married within a year. It wasn't a grand wedding, but it was warm and full of hope. Her colleagues from school contributed, her church members sang and prayed, and Dominic's family arrived late, loud, and barely involved. Still, Sandra smiled through every part of it. She wore her white gown like it was woven from faith itself, and when Dominic slipped the ring on her finger, she didn't just say yes, she believed it. In the early days of their marriage, things were simple. She would return from school, prepare his meals, and ask about his job hunt, even when she knew he hadn't left the house all day. He always had excuses, and she always had patience. Over time, patience became habit, and habit became silence. Still, she supported him. When his younger brother needed money for school, she sent it. When his cousin wanted to start a small tailoring shop, she gave the seed capital. Even when his mother fell ill and they couldn't afford medicine, It was Sandra who took money from her savings and paid the bills. She did it all without question, not because she didn't see their ingratitude, but because she believed goodness was a seed that eventually bore fruit. But the fruit never came. The more she gave, the less they respected her. Yet she kept giving, not out of pride, but out of the belief that family was sacred, even when it was cold. Dominic, for all his early warmth, began to shift. He stayed out later, laughed less with her, and spoke more on the phone in hushed tones. Still, Sandra convinced herself that every marriage had its shadows. What mattered was keeping the flame alive, even if she was the only one tending it. Dominic's family, especially his mother, treated Sandra like an outsider who had wandered too far into their yard. His sister, Nena, was especially unkind, always making snide remarks and offering help only when eyes were watching. Yuzo, the cousin who now ran a tailoring shop in the market, rarely said thank you, even after Sandra bought her first sewing machine. Whenever they visited, Sandra cooked enough to feed an army, made sure the house sparkled, and gave them small envelopes of money as they left. They never stayed long, and they never called unless they needed something. Dominic saw this, but he never defended her. "That's how they are," he'd say. "Don't take it personal." But how could she not? Each visit left her feeling emptier, like a well that was being drawn from but never refilled. Even the neighbors began to whisper. One old woman once said, "Sandra is plucking stars from her sky and giving them to people who curse the night." Still she smiled. Not because she agreed, but because fighting would break her before it changed them. One day, as she sat outside watching the harmattan dust dance over the road, she caught herself thinking, if I disappear tomorrow, would they even notice? The question frightened her, not because of the answer, but because of how calmly it came. That evening, Dominic came home with talk of visiting his family for the weekend. Sandra agreed. After all, it had been months. Maybe things had changed. Maybe kindness would finally speak louder than resentment. She didn't know then that the visit would crack everything she had spent years gluing together. She didn't know that behind the walls of that visit, a truth was waiting, sharp, cruel, and ready to cut her wide open. The sun came out late that Friday morning, hiding behind thick gray clouds like a child unsure of the day ahead. Sandra sat quietly on the bed, folding clothes one by one into a small travel bag while the radio played low from the corner of the room. Dominic stood by the doorway, fastening the buttons on his shirt with one hand and scrolling through his phone with the other. The house felt still, like it was holding its breath. Sandra didn't say much. She moved in silence, folding a wrapper, then a blouse, then a scarf she hadn't worn in years but decided to take anyway. There was no excitement in her movement, no giddy energy of someone going to see loved ones. Instead, her hands moved as though fulfilling a duty, careful, methodical, numb. Dominic occasionally glanced in her direction, but his eyes were unreadable, like someone looking at an old photograph they didn't want to remember. When she zipped the bag and placed it by the door, he finally spoke. "Hope we won't stay too long. You know I hate sleeping over in that house." Sandra smiled faintly. "We'll see how it goes." He didn't reply. They both stepped outside, locking the door behind them, and walked to the car parked beneath the mango tree that shaded their compound. The journey ahead wasn't long in distance, but Sandra felt the weight of it settle on her chest like a wet blanket. She didn't know why she felt so uneasy. Maybe it was the silence Dominic wrapped himself in. Maybe it was the way he looked out the window during the drive, avoiding her eyes. Or maybe it was that quiet voice inside her that had started whispering louder over the past few months, warning her that something wasn't right, that something she couldn't yet name was about to unfold. The drive to Adiala was marked by patches of silence broken only by the occasional song on the car stereo. Dominic wasn't one for road conversations, and Sandra didn't push. She watched the familiar sights pass by, old women selling oranges in basins too heavy for their backs, barefoot children chasing tires along dusty roads, and motorcyclists weaving through traffic like leaves caught in a stream. Her hometown always looked the same, like a painting hung in the same corner of a forgotten gallery, aging quietly, never complaining. As they approached the junction leading into Dominic's family compound, Sandra noticed the same rusted gate, the same crooked fence with overgrown weeds, and the same orange tree in the front yard that hadn't borne fruit in years. Nothing had changed on the outside, yet something inside her chest shifted. The car stopped, and before Dominic could get out, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned, then quickly pocketed it. Sandra noticed. He didn't offer an explanation, and she didn't ask. The front door opened before they reached it, and Yuzo came out, wearing a wide smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Our wife, she exclaimed, arms outstretched. You're glowing, oh. Sandra hugged her briefly, feeling the stiffness in the girl's embrace. Behind her, Dominic's mother stood in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest, her expression unreadable. She gave Sandra the kind of hug people give when they want to be seen hugging, not when they actually care. The inside of the house smelled of fried fish and camphor. Sandra glanced around, seeing the familiar photos on the wall, the peeling paint, and the old radio still sitting like a shrine on the wooden shelf. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace but from people hiding conversations behind closed doors. She sat on the edge of the couch, back straight, her bag still at her feet. Dominic disappeared into the back room without a word. It had begun, and Sandra knew it, not because of what anyone said, but because of what they didn't say. An hour passed, then two, and still Sandra sat among them, smiling politely, answering questions about work and health, all the while watching how the conversations twisted around her. They spoke to her, but they didn't involve her. Her words floated like feathers in a storm, seen but not heard. Dominic's sister Nena arrived not long after, carrying a small nylon bag, and wearing an expression that mirrored her mother's, flat, guarded, suspicious. She barely greeted Sandra before sitting down, and immediately engaging her mother and Yuzo in a hushed conversation that excluded Sandra entirely. She didn't mind. At least, that's what she told herself. She got up once to help in the kitchen, but Yuzo quickly said, Don't worry now. You're a visitor today. Just relax. Yet somehow, that relax came wrapped in condescension, as though Sandra was being kept out rather than being cared for. She returned to her seat and crossed her legs, her eyes scanning the room, her mind turning over questions she didn't dare ask. Where was Dominic? Why was he taking so long in the back room? Why did everyone act like her presence was something to be endured rather than welcomed? The clock ticked louder than usual. Every tick sounded like footsteps, like something approaching, slowly, deliberately. She finally stood and smiled at them. Excuse me, I need to use the restroom. They nodded without much interest. She walked down the hallway, past the bedroom door where Dominic's voice could be faintly heard, then turned into the tiny corridor that led to the back. But she didn't go to the restroom. She stepped into the sitting room again, quietly, unseen, and reached behind the curtain where her bag sat half open. From it, she pulled out her phone and tapped twice on the screen, opening the voice recorder. She placed it behind the flower vase at the corner of the TV stand, beneath a dusty, artificial lily. Then she stood, adjusted her blouse, and walked out again, this time for real. Her steps were calm, deliberate, her face neutral. No one suspected a thing. The trap had been set, not out of malice, but from a need to know. Sometimes the truth hides in laughter. And Sandra, tired of hearing echoes, wanted to know what people said when they thought she wasn't listening. She returned to the living room to find the air slightly changed, like someone had said something and swallowed it just as she entered. They welcomed her back with forced smiles, offered her drinks, and continued chatting about a neighbor's son who had traveled abroad. Sandra sipped her drink slowly, nodding along. When Dominic finally returned, he sat beside her, placing his hand gently on her thigh, like a man eager to perform affection. She didn't flinch. She simply smiled and leaned into him, resting her head briefly on his shoulder. But inside her mind, a clock had begun to tick. Every second was now a marker, every laugh a potential dagger, every word a test. She watched their faces, memorized their expressions, tried to read the gaps between their sentences. And as the afternoon sun shifted across the living room floor, casting long shadows against the faded wall, she knew she wouldn't stay the night. The idea of sleeping under the same roof with people who might carry knives behind their backs unsettled her more than she could admit. She nudged Dominic gently, and whispered that they should head back before dusk. He hesitated for a moment, then agreed, offering excuses to his family about traffic and unfinished work. They all stood, exchanged farewells, and posed for a quick photo at the gate, the kind where everyone smiles but no one means it. As Sandra stepped back into the car, she kept her eyes forward, her lips sealed, and her heart guarded. Dominic turned on the ignition and drove in silence. She didn't say a word the entire drive back, but her mind replayed everything, the greetings, the looks, the words not said, and most importantly, the phone still recording behind the dusty vase. Truth was no longer a shadow. It was a guest in her house, waiting to be heard. The house greeted them with silence as they stepped inside, the door shutting behind them with a thud that echoed louder than it should have. Evening had come early, with the sky darkening faster than Sandra expected. A faint smell of dust and heat clung to the curtains, and somewhere in the kitchen, a tap dripped like a ticking clock. Dominic went straight to the bedroom, dropping his phone on the bedside table and kicking off his shoes with the tired groan of a man who had done nothing all day. Sandra followed quietly behind, her bag still in hand. She didn't speak. Not from anger, but from something heavier, an awareness, a knowing that now lived inside her ribs like a caged bird. She placed her bag on the floor, unzipped it slowly, and retrieved the phone she had tucked back inside when they left his mother's house. She hadn't looked at it since they got home, but now, as Dominic reached for the TV remote and flipped through channels without care, she stood beside the bed, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the screen. The screen lit up, revealing a still active recording. It had lasted nearly 3 hours before the battery drained and shut it off. Her thumb hesitated, then pressed play. She placed the phone on the table, turned the volume just loud enough to hear, and sat down cross-legged at the edge of the bed. Dominic remained focused on the TV, oblivious. The first few seconds were filled with muffled movement and the soft hum of people settling down. Then came laughter, casual, careless, comfortable. It was the sound of people removing masks, not knowing a mirror watched them. Her heart started to beat in a rhythm her body didn't recognize. The first voice that came through the speaker was Yuzo's, laced with that sarcastic cheerfulness she wore like perfume. "She acts like she's the only one who ever helped anybody," Yuzo said, followed by a scoff. "As if the money she gives us isn't to show off. I swear, she thinks she's our savior." Another laugh followed, Nena's, unmistakably sharp. "Let her enjoy her little charity parade. That's her own way of controlling everybody. She won't rest until we all start bowing to her." Sandra blinked slowly, her lips parted slightly. These were not strangers. These were the people she had fed, clothed, uplifted without ever being asked. The betrayal didn't cut like a knife. It seeped like poison, slow, deliberate, crawling through her veins. Then came a pause, and Dominic's voice entered the space with a calmness that made it worse. "You people don't understand. I'm tired, honestly. If not for the benefits, I would have walked away a long time ago." The room grew colder, though the fan above her head spun without pause. Sandra leaned forward, pressing her hand against her chest. Dominic hadn't noticed. His eyes were still on the screen, laughing at some joke from the show he watched. But his laughter in the recording sounded different, darker, emptier, filled with something she hadn't heard in years. He continued, "I'm just managing. I've been patient. But very soon I'll find my way. You'll see." Laughter again. Long, cruel, collective. They laughed like people relieved that truth had been released from its cage. Sandra's hand trembled as she paused the recording. Her legs felt heavy, like they'd been replaced with stone. She looked at Dominic beside her, as if seeing him for the first time. She rose from the bed quietly, walking to the kitchen without a word. The air in the hallway felt thicker with each step. The light above the sink flickered slightly as she stood there, both hands gripping the edges of the sink to steady herself. Her thoughts refused to settle. They scattered like frightened birds in her mind, crashing into one another. She tried to make sense of what she'd heard, but the more she replayed the voices in her mind, the more distorted they became. Sharp edges, broken laughter, and words shaped like blades. She had been building a home, but somewhere along the way, the walls were painted with pretense, the windows lined with secrets. Her heart felt foreign in her chest, too large and too small at once. She poured herself a glass of water, but didn't drink. The water stood still, untouched, reflecting a woman she no longer recognized. How does someone recover from a betrayal they didn't see coming? How do you mourn a marriage while the person you're mourning is still in the room, humming along to a comedy on TV? She knew she couldn't confront him, not yet. Her spirit wasn't ready for his lies, the excuses, the twisted justifications that would surely follow. She needed time to think, to sit with this wound and understand its depth. Returning to the bedroom, she found him half asleep, one arm tucked beneath his head, his breathing steady, as though nothing in the world was broken. She slid into bed beside him, careful not to disturb the illusion. Her eyes stared at the ceiling for hours, counting shadows, waiting for morning to bring her the strength that night refused to give. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the window with a brightness that felt almost offensive. Birds chirped with enthusiasm, and the neighbors' children screamed as they chased a football across the yard. Sandra moved about the house like someone wading through fog, making breakfast, washing plates, folding laundry. Dominic kissed her cheek on his way out, and she smiled without thinking. It was a smile her face had practiced for years. When the door shut behind him, she locked it gently, then returned to her phone. She listened to the full recording again, this time with a steadier hand and colder eyes. Each voice etched itself deeper into her memory. Her mother-in-law spoke near the end. She gives like she's God. That's why I never asked her for anything directly. Her type always wants to be praised after doing good. Let her finish her performance. There was agreement all around, followed by someone saying, "Na money day control her husband. The day he gets his own, you go see real change." Sandra's hands didn't shake this time. Her heart didn't race. It had settled now like dust after a violent storm. She spent the rest of the day cleaning the house as she always did, humming to herself as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Every spoon she polished, every floor she swept, every cloth she hung out to dry was now part of a farewell ritual she hadn't yet named. The betrayal had stitched itself into her skin, but she wasn't going to tear it out with rage. No, she would sit with it. She would let it teach her something she should have learned long ago, that even the softest hearts deserve boundaries. And that sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's a warning. It began with little things. The next morning, Sandra left the bedroom early, tidied up the living room before Dominic stirred, and prepared his usual breakfast without a single misplaced gesture. The scent of fried yam filled the kitchen, and the aroma of peppered eggs drifted lazily through the house, just as it always did. But something invisible sat in the air that hadn't been there before. The house still echoed with familiar sounds, the creak of the wardrobe, the rhythm of the ceiling fan, the occasional thump of footsteps outside, but inside Sandra, a stillness had taken root. She moved through the motions with quiet precision, the way one does when they've made up their mind about something but aren't ready to speak it aloud. When Dominic appeared, yawning and scratching the back of his head, she handed him his plate with a soft "good morning," her tone warm but hollow. He smiled, perhaps thinking the visit to his family had gone smoothly, perhaps unaware of the things that now hovered between them like an unseen fog. He spoke casually, recounting something a friend had told him, and she nodded where appropriate, but her mind wasn't there. It was tracing words from the night before, each one like a bead in a broken necklace, scattered, sharp-edged, impossible to ignore. Her eyes lingered on him longer than usual, studying the curve of his cheek, the way he chewed, the casual manner in which he glanced at his phone between bites. It was as if she were looking at a stranger who had borrowed her husband's face. He looked up at her once and raised a brow. "You're quiet today," he said. "Did I forget something?" She shook her head, smiling faintly. "Not at all." And she meant it. He hadn't forgotten something. He had revealed everything. Sandra didn't stop being herself. That was part of the brilliance in her approach. She cooked, cleaned, ironed his shirts, and folded his trousers with the same neatness he had always known. But what changed was the way she watched him, not with suspicion, but with realization. There was no longer that eagerness to impress, to fix, or to chase his attention. The approval she had once yearned for now seemed small, even laughable. She began waking up before dawn, taking long walks around the neighborhood before he got out of bed. She greeted the neighbors warmly, chatted with the old tailor down the road, and even helped the woman who sold akra by the corner, something she hadn't done in months. Her spirit was stretching again, like a bird slowly remembering how to use its wings. At home, she remained polite but slightly removed, never cold, never unkind, just distant enough to notice. Dominic, at first, didn't question it. He assumed she was tired, overwhelmed by work. But as days passed, he began to sense something. One evening after dinner, he leaned against the kitchen door and asked, "Are we okay?" Sandra, who was washing plates, turned off the tap and dried her hands slowly before facing him. "Of course," she replied, her tone even. "Why do you ask?" He hesitated, shrugged. "I don't know. You've been different." She smiled. "Maybe I'm just thinking more lately." He chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to push or let it go. In truth, he had no idea that Sandra had already begun building a different life, not outside their home, but within herself. Each day, she laid bricks of detachment, walls that would soon become her refuge. She started saving her salary in a new account, quietly transferring funds out of their shared purse. She reached out to a former colleague who had offered her a teaching position in another district months ago. Slowly, methodically, she began preparing for something she had never thought herself capable of, leaving without shouting, breaking away without begging. Dominic noticed more than he admitted. She wasn't angry, but there was an absence in her affection, a lack of that familiar softness she used to carry toward him like a second skin. He began staying home more often, not out of guilt but out of fear. Fear that something was slipping from his grip, something he hadn't realized he valued until it stopped flowing freely. One afternoon, he brought her flowers, a gesture he hadn't made since their 3rd anniversary. She took them with a smile, placed them in a jar, and said thank you. No tears, no excitement, no hint of the woman who used to gush over small kindnesses. He tried initiating conversations, asking about her day, volunteering to help with dinner, and offering to pick her up from work. She accepted all these with grace, but never leaned into them. It was as though he was pouring water into a basket. No matter how much he gave, it never held. One night, he turned to her in bed and said, "Do you still love me?" She blinked in the dark, then turned to face him. Her voice was calm, too calm. "I'm not sure what that word means anymore." That silence that followed was heavier than any argument they'd ever had. He didn't respond, just rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling. Sandra turned away, her eyes wide open in the dark. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't crafting schemes. She was simply detaching, day by day, like a vine releasing itself from a wall it once clung to. And each moment of her silence wasn't an act of anger. It was preparation. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want apologies. What she wanted was peace. And if it meant finding it without him, then so be it. The day she decided to leave didn't come with drama. No thunderstorm, no shouting match, no smashed plates. It was a regular Thursday morning. She dressed in a simple blue gown, brushed her hair into a bun, and packed her bag slowly, folding her clothes the same way she had done before their visit to Adiala. Dominic had left earlier for work, still thinking everything was just a temporary chill, something they would warm through eventually. He didn't know Sandra had spoken to a landlord in a different town, didn't know she had submitted a transfer request through the education board, didn't know she had cleared out her portion of the joint account last night while he slept. The house was quiet when she wrote the note, 8 simple lines. No tears, no bitterness. She placed it gently on the dining table beside the flowers he had given her, now slightly wilted but still standing. She locked the door, slid the key under the mat, and walked away without looking back. On the road, she didn't rush. She moved like someone returning to herself, step by step. The breeze kissed her cheek, and for the first time in years, she felt light. Her phone buzzed as she boarded the bus. It was Dominic, probably wondering where she was. She silenced it, placed it in her bag, and looked out the window. The town faded behind her, shrinking into the background like a painting she no longer belonged in. Ahead, the road curved gently into a sky that seemed to open just for her. She breathed deeply, not with regret, but with relief. For the first time in a long while, Sandra was not someone's wife, someone's helper, someone's silent sacrifice. She was just herself. And that, finally, was enough. Dominic first noticed the change not from her absence, but from the way silence filled the house in her place. It wasn't just that Sandra was gone, it was how completely she had gone. The living room bore no trace of her perfume, the kitchen lacked its usual warmth, and the bedroom felt like a museum of someone who had once lived there but never truly belonged. He had returned from work expecting her to be home, expecting her to emerge from the bathroom with a towel around her hair, or to find her watering the small aloe vera plant she always said reminded her of her grandmother. But the stillness of the house greeted him instead. The curtains were drawn neatly, her slippers were no longer by the door, and the faint echo of a woman's laughter, one he used to take for granted, was nowhere to be found. At first, he assumed she had gone to visit a friend, or maybe traveled for work without mentioning it in the rush of the week. He called her phone, but it rang only once before going dead. It was the kind of silence that pressed into your ears and made you hear things that weren't there. When he spotted the folded note on the dining table, his fingers trembled slightly before he picked it up. Her handwriting stared back at him, elegant, composed, final. There were no accusations in her words, no bitterness, just quiet clarity. She had thanked him for the years, explained that she needed space to breathe again, and ended it with a line he couldn't forget. "I stayed too long at the door of people who never opened it." He read it again, and again, but no matter how many times he read it, it didn't bring her back. The next few days unraveled slowly, like fabric coming loose at the hem. Dominic moved through them in a daze, showing up at work but barely speaking, eating food without tasting it, watching the news without hearing a word. He kept checking his phone, expecting a message that never came. He called her line more times than he could count, but it always rang unanswered or went straight to voicemail. Eventually, the line stopped connecting altogether. He drove to her school, but she had officially transferred. He asked her friends, but none of them gave him more than polite shrugs. It wasn't that they didn't know, he could tell by the way they looked at him. It was that they didn't want to be part of whatever mess had driven her away. His mother called a few days later, asking if Sandra had sent more money for her prescriptions. When Dominic told her that Sandra had left, there was a pause, then a disapproving sigh. She left? His mother repeated, like the idea itself was offensive. What do you mean she left? To where? He didn't answer. He couldn't. And when he mentioned that the financial support had also stopped, her tone shifted. So after everything we did for her, this is how she repays us. That sentence hung in the air like a foul smell. Dominic wanted to remind her of the many times Sandra had gone out of her way to help. The hospital bills, the groceries, the school fees, the little loans she had never asked to be repaid. But he said nothing. Maybe because he was still trying to protect his pride, or maybe because, deep down, he knew the truth didn't need defending. In those days of solitude, the recording came back to haunt him, not as a file Sandra sent, but as a memory he couldn't erase. The laughter, his own voice admitting things he didn't think would ever leave that room. They played in his head like a bad song stuck on repeat. He remembered her face the night they returned, how calm she had seemed. And now he understood. She had already heard everything. Yuzo came to visit one rainy afternoon, uninvited and unannounced. She entered the house like she owned it, shaking water from her umbrella and plopping down on the sofa without so much as a greeting. Dominic barely looked up from where he sat. She was chewing gum, loud and careless, her presence as familiar as it was irritating. So what's the next move? She asked, eyeing him. Are you going to go and beg her or just sit here like a log? He didn't respond. She clicked her tongue and leaned forward. You messed up, Dominic. All of you did, she added quickly, as if removing herself from the blame. But you more than anyone. You think women like Sandra grow on trees? Her voice carried a harsh truth, one he couldn't argue with. You know what hurts the most, she went on. She didn't even shout. She didn't fight. She just walked away. That's the kind of leaving you don't recover from. He felt something shift inside him then. Not anger, not sadness, something colder. Regret, maybe. But it was too late. He reached for the remote and turned on the TV, needing noise to drown her voice. Yuzo stood and scoffed. Keep pretending, Dominic. Let's see where it gets you. She left the way she came, not bothering to shut the door properly behind her. He sat there for hours afterward, staring at the screen without seeing it. Everything felt unreal, as if he were living inside a story he didn't write. He was surrounded by furniture Sandra had picked, walls she had painted, dishes she had arranged. But without her, the house was a skeleton, a structure with no soul. He walked to the wardrobe and opened it, not to look for something, but to face the emptiness. Her clothes were gone. Even her scent had disappeared. He reached up, pulled down a dusty handbag she had once forgotten on the top shelf, and clutched it like a fool searching for memories. But it was just a bag. It told him nothing. Outside, the days went on. The sun rose and set without asking him how he felt. Life, as always, moved forward. Sandra, too, was living, quietly, in a new place where no one knew her as someone's wife. She went back to teaching with a new fire in her spirit. She planted a small garden outside her flat and spent weekends reading in the shade. She hadn't blocked Dominic, but she never replied to his messages. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't broken either. She was simply learning what it meant to be whole without being someone else's pillar. There were nights she sat alone, listening to music and drinking tea, and remembered his laugh or the way he used to dance in the kitchen when she played high-life music. But the memories no longer held her hostage. They passed through her like smoke, visible, but not solid enough to hold. Her neighbors liked her. The students at her new school admired her. She walked with ease now, with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. And each time she saw a woman walking with her head down, she wanted to tell her, "You don't owe anyone your silence." But she didn't say it. She just smiled, held the door open, or offered a helping hand. Her peace was loud enough without words. Dominic would go on trying. He would call, he would send messages, maybe even show up one day. But she had already made her choice, and it wasn't him. It was herself. Time did not heal Sandra. It simply gave her room to understand herself beyond the version of her that once begged for belonging. In the stillness of her new home, she began to relearn the rhythm of her own voice. She no longer waited for someone to ask about her day, or leaned her hopes against another's mood. Her mornings were quiet, filled with the hum of a ceiling fan, the rustle of paper from her school notes, and the occasional chirp of birds from the guava tree outside. She had moved into a small but cheerful flat, with pale yellow curtains that let sunlight stream in like grace itself. On Sundays, she walked to a nearby church where no one knew her history, and afterwards, she would stop at the market to buy vegetables wrapped in brown paper. The woman at the stall always added an extra tomato with a smile, perhaps sensing something unspoken. There was no more need to explain herself, to soften her truths, or defend her silence. She greeted people with warmth, helped her students with their essays, and sometimes sat with her neighbor's child, helping him learn how to read. Her life was simple, but it was hers, and that, more than anything, gave her peace. Each time she walked past a mirror, she saw a version of herself that had survived not just the pain, but the slow erosion of dignity. She hadn't run away. She had simply stopped clinging to a door that was never meant to open. In the quiet moments, she often returned to that evening she listened to the recording. Not with anger, but with a kind of disbelief at how calmly she had sat through it. It felt now like a turning page, the kind of moment that split a life into before and after. Dominic kept calling. It started as once a day, then stretched into long gaps of silence followed by sudden bursts of pleading. His messages came in different tones, some apologetic, some accusing, some begging for a second chance. She read most of them, not out of interest, but because she wanted to know how long it would take for him to understand that words alone were not enough. He wrote that he missed her cooking, her laughter, her quiet presence beside him at night. He asked her to remember the good times, the shared dreams, the promises made under the mango tree in their compound. But each message only confirmed what she already knew. He missed her comfort, not her soul. He wanted the version of her that held everything together, not the version that finally put herself first. One afternoon, while she was grading essays in the staff room, her phone lit up with another call from him. She didn't answer. Instead, she placed the phone face down and continued reading a student's sloppy handwriting. Her peace had grown too tall to be shaken by familiar voices. That evening, she walked to the edge of a hill just outside the town, a place she discovered on one of her early morning walks. From there, the landscape stretched wide, red roofs, green trees, narrow roads snaking like vines through the town. She stood quietly, the breeze tugging at her scarf, and whispered a name that no longer held weight. In that moment, she wasn't thinking of vengeance or validation. She was thinking of freedom, the kind that isn't loud or theatrical but firm, steady, and irrevocable. Letting go hadn't been an act of rebellion. It had been survival. And survival, she had learned, didn't always look like a fight. Sometimes it looked like packing a small bag, locking the door softly behind you, and walking into the unknown with nothing but your name. There was a day he came to find her. It was a Saturday morning, warm and windless. She had just returned from the local library where she volunteered to help children with their reading, when she heard a knock that wasn't familiar. Opening the door slowly, she saw him standing there, thinner, more tired, dressed in the same brown shirt he often wore during their early days together. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her like someone waking from a long, uncomfortable sleep. Sandra didn't flinch. She stood tall, her expression unreadable, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to give. He took a breath, stepped forward slightly, then stopped himself. "I didn't come to make noise," he said quietly. "I just wanted to see you. To say I'm sorry. For everything." The words hung in the air like wet clothes, heavy and awkward. She nodded, her arms folded across her chest, waiting. "I miss us," he added. "I know I was wrong. I've changed. She raised her hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. "You miss the life you lost," she said softly. "Not the person you broke." He swallowed hard. Behind him, a boy rode past on a bicycle, whistling a tune that clashed with the tension of the moment. "I won't disturb you again," Dominic said, voice barely above a whisper. She gave a small nod. He turned and walked away, slower than he had arrived. She closed the door without slamming it, returned to her seat by the window, and picked up the novel she had been reading. The sun spilled across the pages, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She simply breathed, long, deep, and full. Months passed. The town changed in small ways. New shops opened, roads got patched, a new teacher joined the school. Sandra remained steady, her life unfolding one quiet moment at a time. She had started saving toward building her own home. Not a mansion, but a small place with a garden and a porch where she could sit in the evenings with a cup of tea. Her neighbors respected her, not just for how she carried herself, but for the way she never gossiped, never pretended. When people asked about her past, she smiled and changed the subject. There was no need to retell what had already been buried. Pain, after all, didn't need an audience to be real. One evening, as rain fell gently against her window, she lit a candle and wrote in her journal. She wrote not about him, but about herself, how far she'd come, how many parts of her had been stitched back together. She wrote about mornings that now brought peace instead of anxiety, and nights that no longer felt like cages. She ended the page with a sentence that stayed with her long after the ink dried. Some endings are quiet victories. She closed the book, blew out the candle, and lay on her bed, listening to the rain tap a soft rhythm against the world outside. Peace didn't arrive with a bang. It came like this, slow, gentle, honest. And that was enough. Sometimes the greatest act of love is choosing yourself. Don't stay where you're only valued for what you give, and not for who you are. You are not a ladder for people to climb, or a shelf for others to rest on. You are whole. You are worthy of peace, respect, and truth. And if you ever feel like your silence is being mistaken for weakness, remember, leaving quietly can sometimes be the loudest thing you ever do. May your heart never settle where it's not cherished. May your kindness never be taken for granted. May your light never be dimmed by the shadows of others. I pray that every time you give, you'll also receive. May you be surrounded by people who speak well of you in every room. And when your soul gets tired, may peace find you gently and stay. May you never beg for love that was meant to be given freely. And when it's time to walk away, may you have the strength to do it with your head held high and your spirit untouched. If you believe it, say a big amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.